Heute die Referentin ist Professorin Dr. Sonia Fizek. Ich hoffe, ich habe es jetzt richtig ausgesprochen. Sie ist gebürtige Polin und ging aber für den Master und den anschließenden Doktor auf die englischsprachige Insel an die Bangor University und promovierte dort in Media and Game Studies. Ja, also in Nordrhein-Westfalen oder auch bundesweit ist sie eine Koryphäe auf dem Gebiet der Medienwissenschaften und Videospielewelt und im Cologne Game Lab der Technischen Hochschule in Köln sehr aktiv. Sie begleitete schon unzählige Preisvergaben als Jurymitglied, also hat immer den aktuellsten Einblick in diese Welt der Videospiele und forscht aktuell zu Greening Games und auch zur nachhaltigen Transformation der europäischen Spieleindustrie. Heute referiert sie für uns über Video Games in Times of Climate Crisis. In drei Säulen haben wir gerade besprochen, sodass Sie zwischendurch gerne Fragen stellen können, sowohl auf Englisch als auch auf Deutsch im Chat. Ich lese sie dann gerne vor, wenn Sie nicht selber sich unmuten möchten. Und genau, ich bin sehr gespannt. Ich lerne viel dazu und freue mich, dass Sie heute hier sind. Mrs. Fizek, the floor is yours. Enjoy.
Dankeschön. Dann switch es gleich ins Englische, sodass wir alle nicht zu verwirrt sind. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. As I said in the little warm-up discussion we had, it reminds me a little bit of the hybrid and online teaching a couple of years ago during the COVID pandemic. I can only hope to keep you a little bit awake. And I hope that we will have lively discussions throughout the talk. Because most of you don't know me, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, Anna. I thought I'll give you a little bit of an idea, at least, into how I got into the topic of ecology or environmental sustainability and video games. So a few years ago, I was working with a few friends of mine on an idea. And it all started with that idea that back then did not have to do much with video games yet, but with film. We won the first award in the Utopie Parcours competition here in Berlin. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to develop an intuitive application that would help filmmakers to shoot films in a more environmentally friendly way. And in the world of film, back in 2020, there was already a lot of talk about the so-called green production. There were guidelines, German-wide, depending on the Bundesland. So there was a lot of material already to look into. As you can imagine, the award was very modest, so we did not we did not manage to turn this idea into a startup that we envisioned. But during this process of thinking through this idea, I learned a lot, and I always wondered, what if some of those ideas were transplanted into the context of games? And in 2020, there was still very little done in the area of video games. In academia, a little bit more. There were colleagues, of course, writing, at least in the English, German, and Polish-speaking academic discourse that I'm aware of. There were colleagues who were writing about video games, ecology, nature. I'm by far not, one of the first people who did that. But it was almost invisible outside of video games. This means that the production of video games, or the games industry, or game developer community did not really that much wake up until end of 2019. So those ideas that I had with Greta, I brought into the first project that was running from 2021 to 2024, and it was called Greening Games. The website is still alive and active, so please feel free to explore if you're interested. This was a project within the framework of the Erasmus Plus. This means that it was highly focused on didactics. That is, how do we actually teach? How do we put all that plethora of knowledge across? What does that mean? You had a session last week within the context of probably using games and serious games and ecology, but games and climate crisis or games and environmental issues are very interdisciplinary. It's a web of relations. So it's very hard to think from the perspective of teaching students. And then it also depends in which department. So at Cologne Game Lab, where I'm based at TH Köln, we are teaching students who will be the future game developers mostly. I am responsible for media and game studies, so the humanities perspective. Other colleagues are teaching programming, arts, design, and all those different perspectives come with very different questions related to sustainability. And this is what this project tried to tackle, this interdisciplinary of angles and then producing reliable teaching materials for that. And that finally brought me to the latest project, and this one is very much in the running right now. It's a much bigger project, this time really focused on not on didactics, but on research, strategies, sustainable transition for Europe's game industries. And within that project, I am leading a work package, and our goal is not to look at games per se, but to look at game developers, European game developers. So it's an ethnographic research with interviews, surveys, participant observation, and fieldwork to find out what the biggest challenges, barriers, opportunities are, what kind of awareness do the developers themselves have, maybe also critique how is it actually looking on the ground, looking beyond the PR materials that are very often, and these days very readily shared by especially bigger game developer players. So this is where it is right now. But my interests in the green aspects around and of video games are much larger than that. So today I will try to give you a little bit of a broader picture. So not focusing on one specific aspect, but picking three very different angles. So my today's talk is an invitation to rethink video games and gaming within the context of the natural, taking environmental sustainability in and of video games as an example. And we will be looking at three different intersections. They're all related with one another. So in the first part of the talk, I will give you an insight into the so-called playing nature. That is the practice of what I call nature playing in video games. We will then move on to designing nature, that is designing for climate awareness. So kind of shifting the focus from, being the players inside of the game and trying to play green, whatever that means, to thinking about what kind of tools or conceptual tools designers have to design for awareness that might be coinciding a little bit with what you have heard last week, or at least that's a similar angle. And then the third intersection will move us to exploiting nature. So that's maybe the least optimistic part, but also one that is a ground part of environmental sustainability and games and video games specifically. So we will be looking at the issues of materiality of digitality, the questions related to the cost of making games. Okay. And before I start with the first part, I would like to just remind you that I will be stopping after each one of those intersections and then opening the floor for discussion, hopefully keeping you a little bit more live and not falling asleep by the end we're done. All right. So, playing nature. Let me start with a scenario, a story. So it was high summer 2022, And in many regions of Europe and worldwide, temperatures reached record heights and unprecedented fires, with over 62 hectares of flora burned by the end of August 2022. Meanwhile, the players of Riders Republic, a major multiplayer sports video game developed and published by Ubisoft, participated in something that was called digital reforestation. So they planted virtual trees in dedicated locations of the map and brought to life an entirely new forested area that stayed in the game for others to experience long after the event had taken place. And the Riders Republic event with digital reforestation as the central mission was hosted for 2 weeks in the summer of 2022, and it culminated in the first ever in-game climate march, for which players were equipped with virtual green t-shirts, banners, and different assets that you see here on the image. And the project was conceptualized in 2021 during the so-called Green Game Jam, organized by the Playing for the Planet Alliance, the environmental program of the United Nations that was brought to life in 2019 and has been quite active ever since. So at its core, Riders Republic, the game that I have just mentioned, is a competitive multiplayer sports game. It has nothing or very little to do with environmental messaging, right? It's not something that you would call an ecological game. But it may also inspire a more contemplative mode of play, one that puts the aesthetic experience of nature to the forefront. And this is not a default practice in that game. It has been designed with a challenge-based core gameplay dynamic. However, the breathtaking in-game vistas and settings literally mirroring landscapes and flora of 6 American or North American national parks seem almost a natural fit for moments of something that we can call synthetic nature contemplation. And this meditative touch behind the in-game natural settings is not a coincidence. It's not a product of chance. Ubisoft Studio, the one that produced Riders Republic, sits in Annecy in France and is located, as you can see here on that picture, literally amid the French Alps. So this deep connection to nature is almost inscribed into the daily lives of many members in the development team. And it's not also something that I came up with. This is something that came to me from the fieldwork, let's say. I had the pleasure to interview early on in the Greening Games project, the second one that I mentioned today. I had the chance to talk to Boris Maniora, who's the gameplay director behind the game. And these are his words. We are all passionate about the outdoors. There's no real coincidence. If you look outside of the studio, you will see that it's surrounded by mountains. You can't fight against that. So technologically mediated landscapes may turn into settings for ecological awareness or simply spaces of nature appreciation, even without dedicated climate crisis-related events. Riders Republic exerts a powerful aesthetic effect on its players, at least on me, maybe not on everybody. And in the first part of my talk, I want to present to you this phenomenon of connecting with technologically mediated nature through digital play. And I will frame this practice as nature playing, a contemplative mode of being in the game world. Nature playing does not see the surrounding natural terrain solely as a collection of optimized game levels, but instead facilitates unspecified contemplative traversal through the game. And maybe you are gaming yourselves, probably a lot of you in this group are. So try to think of whether you have, without naming it, anything specific like nature playing, whether you have ever been stunned by in-game or game world nature, whether it has ever struck you that, instead of following a narrative or fulfilling a quest, that you kind of stopped and wandered around just, to admire the beauty of what kind of surrounds you. And this focus of mine on the contemplation of the natural world in Writers' Republic is a project that originally was inspired, on the one hand, by this conversation with the game developer Boris Maniora that I just mentioned, whom I interviewed in May 2022. On the other hand, it was inspired by the teaching, I will mention it briefly in a few slides' time, of two colleagues of mine from the Media Studies department at Potsdam University during the Corona time. And that seminar that they designed was specifically devoted to the so-called nature playing and nature writing. You will see where I'm going with that in a sec. So my point of departure for nature playing, those of you who might have guessed based on the collocation, is nature writing. And nature writing is a form of practicing writing, and it's also a literary genre, whose goal is to connect with the natural world. It is often defined by human perception and experience of it. For instance, for the comedy of the German Award for Nature Writing, something like this exists, it is the human perception and a concrete experience of nature rather than nature as such that define the genre. For the writer David Rains Wallace, the nature of nature writing lies in its capacity to position nature as a subject and as a setting, an element of poetic sensibility. And more recently, the idea about nature writing has taken a more visibly ethical and political turn. In a 2023 essay on the problem of nature writing, Jonathan Frazen states, "We live in a world where nature is rapidly receding from everyday life. There's an urgent need to interest non-believers in nature, to push them toward caring about what's left of the non-human world." And you can think that video games, or virtual environments are almost a natural fit for this kind of genre of convincing nature writing. In games, the sense of purpose is created not using literary devices or dramaturgic arc, but by meaningful event and experience-driven game design. So consider our introductory example of digital reforestation in Writers' Republic. It was an event, a time-bound event that lasted 2 weeks, built in to the existing video games. So video games can be, it's not easy, of course, to achieve that, but they can be, or maybe, perfect virtual stages for visually breathtaking natural setting, which may become spaces for curated ecological events, such as the Writers' Republic reforestation event, or, as it was then in my case with nature playing, personal aesthetic experiences. I have another example from a very different game. You may recognize it. So appreciating the natural world may be inspired by contemplating its digitally mediated representation. And one of the reviews of another game, Ghost of Tsushima, the author emphasizes the aesthetic seduction that the game world's designers cast over the players as they're confronted with, quote, lush meadow of crimson flowers, lit with a perfect approximation of just before a rain shower's sun, or a cloud-wreathed mountain looming far off in the distance. Also very poetic, right? So the way it's described, this kind of experience of being in the synthetic world of synthetic nature, is in itself a genre of nature writing. And this capacity of video games to depict and simulate nature extend nature writing originally born into a literary genre into the digital realm. And as Alenda Chang writes, games can offer a compelling way to reconcile a deep connection to nature and the non-human world with an equally important connection to technology and the virtual. So I think it's a very powerful quotation. is really thinking a bit more broadly about it. It's not always about the fact that games are supposed to, in the vein of, behavioral psychology, nudge you into something, or that you're supposed to see short-term effects in your, everyday actions. It's something that can be, much more gradual or compelling. And this is an example of student work. I already mentioned that I was inspired by the research didactic work of two media scholars, friend of mine and his colleagues, so Sebastian Möhring and Birgit Schneider. And this inspired me to look a little bit deeper into the practice of nature writing with relation to video games. In 2020, Möhring and Schneider conceptualized and taught a course they called Flânerie, Nature Writing in Games and in Reality. By the way, this collected volume slash Sammelband that you see here on this slide is open access, and it was fully edited and designed by the students who were attending that seminar. So it's quite an amazing piece of work that came out of this well, let's say intervention, actually. It's, it was something on the verge of a classical seminar where you read and discuss, but also an intervention. They were nature playing and then writing about their experiences, sometimes also watching others play. So this is the fruit of the collected volume is a fruit of this seminar. So all those, different, let's say, points of departure, inspiration kind of brought me into playing Riders Republic differently, right? Playing it, and I enjoy the competitive mode a lot, and performing the tricks inside of the game. You can, you can ski there, you can cycle, you can also put devices that are a little bit more futuristic and closest to speculative design. And by doing that, you can traverse through the game world. But I decided to do something very different. I was playing the game, and this is the map that you see here, in the so-called Zen mode. So I guess as the name suggests, and you can guess yourselves, Zen mode does not allow you to compete. Also, Zen mode does not put you in a multiplayer mode. So I was alone. It was also very, well, let's say sublime or sometimes quite a weird experience to be inside of this huge world just on my own without any other player. There are no NPCs. There are animals and plants, and the animals are, the kind of sometimes you can see them, but it's not very easy. They're not the main focus of the game. So sometimes you see a bird landing, but it takes a while to observe that. And because it's not the focus of the game, also those moments of looking for, the flora and the fauna are very adventurous in a way. The game world of Riders Republic, I mentioned before, is based on those 6 natural parks of North America, and it's really stunning and how well those worlds are simulated. They were using 3D satellites of terrain, so this means that the settings when you're there, it seems that they're very. It seems as if you were there. I guess even more so for those people who actually went into those places. I think the designers of the game also mentioned to me that the idea of digital tourism came across their mind because they had this feeling of, let's say, it's called digital memory. Of course, for reference points, they not only satellite scanned those terrains, but they were also visiting the sites to get the feeling right for the natural while designing it. Those terrains are, for design purposes, slightly altered, but only slightly. This means that, of course, certain mountain peaks will be flattened, for instance, kind of making sure that you have the right type of terrain for a competitive sport game on different types of sport equipment, so you can actually use the terrain in a more, game-like way. But in Riders Republic, maybe also to come back to Alenda Chang, this quote, permeability between game environments and real environments is almost tangible, right? Due to the fact that you have, especially if you know and you realize that the game worlds that you were experiencing are based on quite accurate terrain scans. This also does something to your experience of this kind of synthetic natural. Mark Bonner, another colleague of mine, who looked into environments and the natural in game worlds, he discussed nature and wandering through landscapes in video games, calling on the writings of John Muir. You might have heard of John Muir, a Scottish-born American naturalist who in 19th century and early 20th century diagnosed wandering in the wilderness as a popularized practice of his time, stemming from the need to step outside of the industrialized everyday. And it's actually quite telling when you read what he writes 100 years ago. The tendency nowadays, this is his words, to wander in the wilderness is delightful to see. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going into the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity. And of course, you know, this kind of parallel between going into the wilderness to regain calm and to slow down and going into the synthetic simulated wilderness, especially in the times of COVID, when again we had this chance where we were forced to slow down, is something that that struck me. So the question is, you know, how does it feel to go into digitized wilderness? And what I want to now share with you to kind of round it up with with nature writing is a short piece of nature writing actually based on a session of nature playing. So I was working on different types, let's say, I called them contemplations. And with each of them, I focused on something else. Sometimes I was more focused on looking for animals. Sometimes I was trying to make my own herbarium. So, you know, scanning the elements of nature, projecting the game with a projector onto the wall, and then scanning it with an app that allowed me to actually check what kind of plants are in the game and kind of collect, let's say, in this kind of digital way, those plants and the knowledge about them. So this contemplation that I want to share with you, or this example of nature writing as nature playing, is called Digital Wilderness, Wandering and Capturing Nature at the Feet of El Captain, that you also see here in the screenshot. A warm orange light descends into the Yosemite Valley as the sun sets below the simulation's horizon. I'm standing in front of a gigantic in-game object that bears a striking resemblance to the southwest face of El Capitan, the largest granite monolith of the world. Meandering through occasional patches of melting snow, I notice a bird of prey silhouette, most probably belonging to a golden eagle, standing out against a ponderosa pine tree. Snap! Pinus ponderosa. In the game world, with birds usually flying in the far distance, this is a rare moment to cherish. I lurked as slowly as I possibly can to be able to capture it. Snap, golden eagle. Something tells me that the chances of seeing this virtual bird land again are not high. The orange light transformed into all shades of pink and purple as I turn around and inhale the atmosphere of the mild evening. In front of me emerges a lush green grass patch with dazzling yellow flowers swaying to the rhythm of the virtual wind. Pausing the gameplay for a moment, I take my phone with the Terra Incognita app, ready to register the flowers of my in-game herbarium. Snap! Eschliolza californica, more commonly known as the Californian poppy. The evening in Riders Republic must be unusually warm, otherwise the Californian poppy should close its petals by now. A few steps away, a patch of deep purple cones invites me to a closer inspection. Snap Lupinus polyphus. Lupines prefer mostly moisty habitats. They must feel at home amidst the melting thin snow caps resting at the foot of El Captain. Having stored my photos and notes, I'm heading down the valley to roam through the poppy meadows. So before completing this, intervention, and there were more than this is just an example. So I was actually spending hours during this, exercise of nature playing. You may think about it as something quite boring, but it turned out to be very meditative. And so before doing that, I envisioned nature playing, from a theoretical perspective in multiple ways. I thought, well, it could be seen as a meditative practice, as a self-conscious experience, maybe as an act of aesthetic pleasure, appreciation, an ecological act, maybe a mood-setting device. So there are many ways of thinking about this, nature playing. I also saw nature playing as a gameplay style that is characterized by walking, waiting, sitting down, resting, talking, and contemplating. This is how Navarro Ramazal, a game studies colleague from Spain, talks about wandering in games. And it seemed a relatively easy task to embark on for the first when I thought about this. And it's only after hours of roaming through those natural virtual settings that I became aware of the challenges and limitations of nature playing, right? So although the setting of the game is stunning, it's not really easy to recreate the feeling of the sublime, which so often accompanies real encounters with magnificent natural settings. And perhaps, this is a question, of course, this form of nature-driven sensibility in virtual game worlds needs to be exercised, learned, but maybe it also is something that we can acquire, that can be newly acquired. That is, of course, a question mark, right? So I guess to now, sum it up, this mode of play or this practice of play turned out to be something that made me, on the one hand, appreciate the synthetic design of nature, but on the other hand, it made me very skeptical towards the capacity actually of the virtual worlds to really put us into this truly contemplative mode of being in nature. And maybe that's something that we don't think about that much 5 years after COVID. But back in the day, there were a lot of texts, not necessarily academic, a lot of journalistic texts and a lot of practices or interventions like this. And some of the colleagues, I remember reading the Guardian article on, going into the game world in order to have a walk because you can't in the real world. So this idea of going out into the digitized or synthetic nature and somehow experiencing it aesthetically and poetically was quite strong a couple of years ago. Okay, so we'll stop here before we move to designing nature, a very different perspective with a very different set of questions. And if you want to, please feel free to jump in. I'm super happy to have a couple of minutes of a conversation. And yeah, feel free to share anything. Maybe also your own experience of, playing nature or wandering in games or being stunned by nature and in specific titles that you play. The floor is open.
Ja, ich hatte auch einmal als kleines Kind so ein Spiel, das war so ein Barbie-Pferdespiel auf der Wii. Und da waren so ganz viele unterschiedliche Landschaften, sowas wie Wälder. Da war ein Strand, so eine Küste, da waren große Felder mit Bäumen. Also ganz viele unterschiedliche und da konnte man damit so fern langreiten. Und das war richtig interessant, das zu beobachten. Auch mit einem Wasserfall war da, mit einer Brücke und alles Mögliche. Das war schon eine sehr schöne Landschaft, wo man, also, sag ich mal so, zu dieser Zeit kannte ich sowas gar nicht irgendwie so zu sehen. Was ich mich aber auch frage, inwieweit sag ich mal, bringt es was, wenn Kinder oder generell Menschen mit so einer digitalen Natur in Verbindung kommen? Weil das ist ja trotzdem irgendwie perfektioniert und bildet nicht genau die reale Welt wider. Also welche Vorteile hat es, dass sie damit in Berührung kommen, im Gegensatz zu dem vielleicht, dass sie dann nicht in die Natur gehen, weil habe ich ja schon erlebt, digital.
Ich glaube, danke erstmal für die Frage und für das Sharing aus der Kindheit. Ich glaube, das ist also für mich nicht die Frage wirklich von Ersetzen, von Erfahrung. Ich glaube nichts und keine synthetische, auch wenn wir mit VR uns ausstatten, das kann natürlich das Naturelle nicht ersetzen und soll das auch nicht ersetzen. Ich glaube, das, was vielleicht interessant ist, ist vielleicht ein bisschen die Frage anders zu denken. Ähm, Dass wir als Menschen, Natur ist nicht etwas, was im Gegensatz zu uns steht. Wir sind eigentlich Teil der Natur, Teil der Welt. Auch Technik ist, das werden wir im dritten Teil von diesem Vortrag sehen, ist auch Teil der Natur. Ähm, Dass wir natürlich das, was uns so wichtig ist, auch simulieren. Nicht das zu ersetzen, sondern wir simulieren halt das, was uns wichtig ist. Wir simulieren die Welten, in denen wir leben. In dem Fall natürlich, mein Beispiel natürlich ist ganz spezifisch. Also das ist, wie gesagt, das ist eine Multiplayer-Sport-Game. Der Sinn und Zweck ist hier nicht jetzt die Natur zu beobachten, so wie ich das getan habe. Aber ich glaube, ganz viele Gamer vielleicht machen das am Anfang so ein bisschen, weil man es tatsächlich ähm, man befindet sich plötzlich in dieser Welt, die ist nur als Game-Level für Sporterfahrung eigentlich gebaut. Aber es ist irgendwie weckt so ein Teil in uns, um diese ja nicht reale, quasi synthetische, simulierte Natur ähm, vielleicht nicht zu bewundern, das ist schon ganz ja romantisch und idealistisch, eher zu erleben. Also ich glaube, das ist das Spannende, dass wir das überhaupt tun, dass wir mit dem Medium, das ist natürlich relativ neu in der Geschichte, dass wir das simulieren, die Natur simulieren, nicht nur repräsentieren, so wie wir das mit Film, mit Gemälden oder mit der Sprache tun und auch immer getan haben in anderen Medien, sondern diesmal tatsächlich auch genau simulieren. Warum? Um etwas zu fühlen, um uns da näher zur Natur irgendwie zu stellen. Genau. Danke, Medina, nochmal. Hat jemand noch eine Erfahrung aus einem Videogame, spezifische Erfahrung mit Natur oder eine Erinnerung?
Also im Chat werden gerade ganz viele Spiele ausgetauscht, die schon gespielt wurden, die zum
Also,
Nachdenken angeregt haben. Eine Frage ist auch, what do you think about putting nature in textbook or exercise sheets and simulate an adventure going through nature by going from task to task? Would it have the same effect as a video game?
okay, I'm reading it. What do you think about putting nature in textbooks, sheets,
I
and
think you would need
simulating an
really good.
adventure going through nature by going from task to task? I'm not sure if I follow. I mean, it's a narrative idea that you seem to be putting through, right? I don't
Or
think will ever have the same effect. It's the question is it the question of effect in a way? I asked this myself as well, but with relation to affect. So that's why at the beginning I thought, okay, what will I feel? I think this is something that made me very curious. Will I feel something? And we all know what it feels like, right? Being in nature, what it can kind of, touch in us. And then I was curious, will that experience, if I like change the vision and if I it was a very curated experience. I almost kind of forced myself to, to be in the natural. What will I feel? What will it feel like? And I think for me, this feeling was something that was not easy. That's why the question at the end, is it something that we have to learn and acquire? Is it possible at all to feel, It's very removed. It doesn't touch many senses. It's very visual and sure, I mean, as you know from video games, the grass is swaying. You can hear the birds. The sound is 3D, of course, but somehow it doesn't touch all the senses, so it feels quite different. Accessibility, I see another question, and the opportunities. That's an interesting one. I think this is where a new window maybe of opportunity opens. And it kind of, your question brings me back to what I've heard from the design director of this game about digital tourism generally as an idea. Not only, this game is not meant for that, but those ideas that kind of he and the team had. On the one hand, maybe for people who can't go there. On the other hand, maybe even as means of protecting nature. Because, you know, all those national parks are actually, again, they are curated and highly romanticized settings, also in nature. And this idea of, you know, a natural reserve or a park going back into the 19th century was actually there also by John Muir that I mentioned today to protect nature against the capitalist forces of industrialization. So you can see it that way. And, you know, of course, an accessibility, so not everybody can actually go there. But again, I mean, it's not something that can replace it. I don't think it's a question of replacement, but maybe creating at least, yeah, you know, a tiny bit of opportunity there. You mentioned Assassin's Creed. Of course, the Red Dead Redemption, also one of the games that I remember from the feeling kind of the natural. I know that for Red Dead Redemption, there's also this practice of vegan running you might have heard of. This is also highly interesting. Vegan runs, so players refusing in Red Dead Redemption to actually hunt and kill. So, you know, people like players are very, I think, ingenious in thinking of new play practices. I don't even think it's all, it doesn't have to be seen as a strategy. It's a practice of experiencing the natural world that was not intended or not thought of by the designers. Far Cry. I haven't played Far Cry. Maybe some other people have too.
Ich sehe schon, wir haben viele Game-Experts in der Runde. Das ist schön. Ja.
Monster Hunt, Pokemon Ruby also pops up, and the concept of walking simulator games, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, Dear Esther, absolutely. Yes, I mean, now in this part of the talk, I did not touch upon it, but of course, when I mentioned wandering and walking, you kind of, it woke a very desired, let's say, association with you, I think, Sven, yes. Absolutely. I mean, this is a genre which was around 2015, maybe slightly earlier. I think Durester was the first one. It was very pejoratively pictured. So as in, you know, through the lack of something, as in you can't do anything there, just walk. But this genre of walking simulator is quite interesting because you can't interact with assets, objects, and you know, there's a little collision built in there. It kind of forces you almost to contemplate more and to kind of walk through the game world in this more contemplative mode. So my intervention of this kind of nature playing, this is the frame I set to what I was doing in the game, has a lot to do with, in a sense, with walking simulators, you know, although they were not meant as simulators of walking. But absolutely. Pixels generated real scenes. I mean, yeah, well, pixels, they're all simulations, you know, at the end of the day. I think what is really stunning and very interesting from a technical perspective about the Riders Republic, that's why I took this as an example, is this 3D scanned terrain. Technically speaking, of course, the 3D scanned terrain, so it's a mashup, of course, of those 6 national parks. The way they exist in the game, they don't exist in reality. they brought those 6 parts together, and there are moments when you go from one until the other in a way that does not exist in reality. But in a sense, this 3D terrain scan ends up in the game engine. And then it's more than pixels. Pixels is just a visual representation. You're thinking, you have to think simulation, actually, and simulation of physics on top of a terrain. Because if they didn't do it in this case, I mean, imagine how would you make sure that the terrain that you're kind of dealing with, the landscape, is actually relatively close to what it is in reality. It would be a very laborious work. You would have to take lots of pictures. It's crazy. So the technology of 3D scanning, of course, exists commercially. That's why they used it. But in other games, it's not necessary if it's not this kind of, closeness to the terrain that you're looking for. I think it was also one of their selling points. Hogwarts Legacy, just walking through those places from the movies that you would explore in my own way. Yeah, I mean, it's a similar feeling maybe to this kind of digital memory. Your memory was a memory from a different medium, from a film, this experience that you had, but then you could kind of experience it in your own pace, a little bit more, let's say, first person perspective. Okay, let's maybe move to the second part. Thank you for all those wonderful, questions, ideas, exchanges, games. So I'm gonna turn off the chat for now. Okay. So now from this mindset of, being in the game worlds as players and, let's say, experiencing them aesthetically and thinking about the practice of play and those different contemplative types of play and encounters that we may have with the natural. I want to move to a very different perspective where we will put a little bit more the head of a designer on. And we will be thinking about what does it mean to design nature? What does it mean to design for a certain effect, maybe? And so we're shifting the focus from the practice of playing nature to that of designing nature and creating awareness for climate issues in the players. I want to stay for a bit within the realm of Ubisoft's Riders Republic because it provides us with really many interesting examples going beyond the Riders Republic, game itself. And those two projects that I want us to have a look at before we move on to theories or to certain types of resources on the so-called green design. Those two projects have implemented the so-called green activations. So elements that had to do with the environment, the climate issues, the ethics and the politics of it. And it's really interesting how it was done in this game. So I mentioned the Project Rebirth, this kind of 2-week digital reforestation event. I want to point us to another one, which is even more interesting. I think it never actually took place. It was just at the stage of concept. It would have taken place a year later, so it was thought of as an event. I tried to reach out to the developers to ask if they actually implemented this, because I couldn't find anything online, but I have not received an answer. Nevertheless, the idea itself is really interesting. So another event, or whether we call it, green event or eco-activation, this doesn't matter that much. But the idea here, and the so-called Project Phoenix, was to bring the players' attention into wildfires, right? I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the wildfires of 2022. Of course, it's not something that just happened in 2022. This is just, this kind of climax, because it allowed me to, it almost happened at the same time when the first green activation was published by the developers of this game. So it's a very powerful coincidence, of course. So a year later, they're thinking about a project, Phoenix, in which parts of the map of the game world would be set on fire on purpose. And by doing that, they would actually disallow players to actually enter into those parts of the game world. So they would be, for a certain period of time, out of reach. And here are just some of the examples of how they would do it. The sky will be orange, and there will be fire, smoke, fog. Players will be equipped with gas masks by default. Part of the map won't be accessible. And the most important idea here, which I think is the strongest one, was to do this one actually unannounced. So that would be something that would actually take you by surprise while you're in the game world. This is a practice or a design pattern that is called forced discomfort, and it can be quite powerful. So it kind of confronts you with something that you're absolutely not expecting in the given context. It's an entertainment AAA game. You're not really looking forward to part of the game or literally, well, metaphorically, of course, burning and kind of not allowing you to participate in. So this is an example, Project Phoenix or Project Rebirth, of using the actually existing games and coming up with interventions inside of them that would raise awareness to a certain nature, ecology, climate crisis related issue. But there are, of course, other games that have been, let's say, designed from scratch with a little bit more ecologically oriented setting or framework. And there are plenty of examples. I'm just really showing just a few. So we're kind of scratching here the surface. And one of such examples is Terra Nil. You might have heard of. And it's a game developed in 2023 by Free Lives, a studio based in Cape Town. And the goal here is to transform a barren wasteland into a thriving ecosystem. And once that action is completed, to leave it in a rocket. This is what you see in the GIF. So basically, to let it be without your human player intervention. And in the words of the designers, Terra Nil is an intricate environmental strategy game about transforming a barren wasteland into a thriving, balanced ecosystem, bring life back to a lifeless world by purifying soil, cleaning oceans, planting trees, and reintroducing wildfire, then leave without a trace. And I remember when I first learned about this game, it was 2023, just after it was released at the GDC, Game Developers Conference. And I'm usually skeptical. But I heard the designer talk about this game, and it was quite a revealing example because it turned out it was not something that they actually envisioned. They were not planning to kind of build this type of game, but at an early development stage, they released this on Steam. I think Greenlight is this option's called. And it came from the player community, this kind of wish to have something that is a little bit more nature-oriented. In most games of this genre, as you know, it's usually, treating resources and natural resources which are endless. So there's this very industrial, capitalist, or exploitative touch to it, right? I mean, it can be, quite fulfilling because it is a simulation. So potentially you would think we can do that. There's no limit there. But it creates a certain, of course, vision of the natural and of how you cultivate or exploit it. So there's something different here that happened in Terra Nil, and it was the player base that actually somehow shifted this project and then kind of made it what it became. But if we think about something, we could call it eco-critical game design, or maybe, ecologically informed game design. What does that actually mean? And in the discussion part, you please feel free to exchange what you've learned from last week or 2 weeks ago. These are just some of the categories that we can think of. So environmental themes, this is probably one of the least powerful, to put a theme into a game that has to do with the environment. It can be powerful though if you think that on a long term, not on a short term, it's not a magical touch of a wand, that all of a sudden an eco game will change people's minds just because there are around 3 billion players around the game, around the globe. It's about creating new imaginaries and new narratives, and that's a slow cultural process. And games are, well, we always say relatively new medium, but if you think about the 70s as the beginning of the first commercial games slowly entering into the living room, they have been there for a while. But this awareness and this kind of awareness of what they come with and how they can create those new imaginaries narrative is something relatively new. They can be powerful. Games can picture, of course, different relationships between human and nature. And there are certain design patterns. So it's a process that can be a design process. It can be more conscious. And there are the so-called design patterns, sometimes called design tactics. I don't like the militaristic metaphor here, that support the ecological message. What are these actually? What does that mean, to think conceptually now about those design tactics or patterns? A lot of them have been singled out in this playbook, in this textbook. And I mention it because it's a fascinating project. It's not a standard textbook. It's not a book that has been, published by an academic publisher. This is really and truly fruit of collaborative work between game developers, mostly, some researchers, but mostly game developers, game designers, worldwide. And they collaborated on it, on this document live. And at some point in early 2022, they kind of, brought it into the community. You can still access this. This is free and open work. And then what they try to do there is they try to give the designers not only a language to kind of, talk with about, let's say, games for change or games for impact, but concrete scenarios. They call them tactics or patterns, concrete ideas of how to do it. And they always bring in an example of a game. So it's not it's quite an easy read, but very useful read. So force discomfort I already mentioned today. This is one of those tactics that they mention. It's a design tactic, a design pattern in which players are placed in situations that create unease, annoyance, anxiety on purpose. And of course, in games, you do not do it. You can do it with language, but you do it with a certain type of event that is built into meaningful event that is built into the game world. A larger narrative depends on what kind of game or genre you're dealing with. And that's why I brought this not realized Project Phoenix as one of our examples. Project Phoenix, so this kind of, potentially burning parts of the map in Riders Republic is an example of forced discomfort. This is the kind of tactic. That's what we're talking about. There are other tools, again, all of that work is really coming from the developer community. This one by Arnaud Fayol, who's it's been working a while for Ubisoft as an art director, and at some point he was so invested into the topics of designing games for creating more awareness for climate crisis that he ended up doing just that work within that company and also beyond, and let's say international game developer community. And years of work went into it. And this is kind of his contribution as an artist and designer to the question of design patterns, or where do we look, what do we focus on when we think about, well, he calls it climate game toolkit. So as you can see here, and it's really quite interesting, Because if you think academically, these categories make so much sense. The aesthetic dimension is there, right? And the aesthetic dimension, going back into nature playing, the beginning of this talk, a lot of it was about aesthetic, actually, and emotional impact, visualization, slightly less about the message. So what you can achieve with visual aesthetic, what kind of message you can carry across with the story, what you can do with gameplay. They call it here, you have behavior transference is actually nothing else than thinking, well, how do I create those events and situations in game that could potentially go beyond creating awareness? How do I make people change their behavior outside of the game? That's a really tricky question, of course. And in that small community, or maybe not that small, of climate conscious game developers, they call it behavior transference. And the questions of tech here have to do more with optimization, something like green coding, for instance. How do I optimize my code, make it more effective so that the software, aka game, running on a machine, let's say PlayStation 4, uses less energy. So there are very different questions, as you can see, that are brought here under one hood, right? The aesthetic of the game itself and the effectiveness of software running on hardware. And this, I will not discuss this, don't worry. This is actually how complicated it gets. If you're interested in those issues, you can follow his work. You can find there are a lot of talks on YouTube in which Arno Fayol is actually unpacking this model, this tools, climate game toolkit. So you can, devote around an hour, listen to one of those talks. And I just want to kind of put you, let's say, into a certain direction if it's the design aspect that you're fascinated with. And something that I found quite powerful when I talked to Arnaud Fayol about games and climate and environment, this is what, amongst many other things, is what he told me. I realized that video games have the power to reshape popular culture by reaching billions of players and giving them a vision of what a desirable future looks like. If you didn't know the context, or you would think, oh, this, sounds quite elevated, right? It's also something that you see a lot in PR materials produced by big game companies. But in this case, it actually is really interesting, was really interesting to listen to that in a larger context, coming from a person who's very ecologically aware and also in his private life, and really believing that, doubting sometimes, that whether it's possible to change something within such a big structure as Ubisoft, but then actually kind of holding on to it and deciding to stay and work together with a lot of other people, and believing that we can, to a certain degree, reshape cultural values through games. It's not about the fact that that those people will reach 3 billion players. That's impossible. Not everybody will care. But if you think about, especially, bigger productions like video games, we really have to think about them as it's mass entertainment products like, Hollywood films. Of course, they will, on a long term, exert a certain influence. So the values that they depict, not in terms of behavioral transference or magically I will change all of a sudden, but they have a lot of power in reaching you emotionally. And the more, the certain types of values are kind of depicted in those games, maybe the more certain topics and sensibilities are kind of landing with a relatively broad audience. I think that's how we should read that point. Okay, I will stop here for a couple of minutes and open the discussion on the design or aspect of games, or I don't know, call it designing for change or impact games, or there's a lot of names for that. So please feel free, the floor is open.
Wir hatten eine Frage von einer Zuhörerin im Chat. Ich weiß nicht, ob sie sich unmuten möchte.
And after, I'll try to be quick so that we have, again, a couple of minutes to reflect. And this third part now moves us away from design or the experience of games and into the realm of the materiality of the medium. Sorry, I had to move some of the of the images because they were covering my slides. So video games are not only drivers of climate positivity, as we saw here, or simulations of stunning natural settings. They are, perhaps, sadly, as much objects of culture, is what we saw in the last hour, as they are of nature. And as virtual and immaterial and clean as they're portrayed within the framework of post-industrial capitalism, they're literally made out of natural resources. And that's something I want us to unpack. What does that mean? Games are made out of, natural resources. You mentioned today that they are made out of pixels, right? So I guess maybe what I want to say here in this third part is that pixels are not virtual. Pixels are something that is very tangible and very material. And let me unpack this and show you in a few examples. How is this possible? What is she talking about? So we can think of video games, thinking with Sean Kubit, a media theoretician, as finite resources in the closed system of planet Earth. I guess that's something maybe that should kind of stick with us now for the rest of this talk. Games as video games, in this case, as finite resources, as material resources. And navigating, those material interdependencies can be quite challenging, and tracking down this kind of those material aspects of games. So I guess perhaps the first crucial step is to rethink the relationship by breaking the enchantment that inflames the passion for media technologies. And what would that mean? So we can break that enchantment, for instance, by going beyond thinking about video games as, hiding or hidden, or thinking what hides, let's say, behind playful interfaces and shiny screens. This is just, an image that kind of illustrates what we usually think of. We think about this visual representational layer. We think about the images when we think about video games. So disenchanting technology and video games can be done by telling stories of resource extraction, for instance, and exploitation. It's a question, a more rhetorical question now. Think before I reveal, think what you see here on this slide. I'll give you a few seconds. Maybe you'll guess. It's a mine of sorts. What is mined there? Cobalt. And cobalt is needed in every single piece of device that has a lithium battery, right? Including gaming hardware. So we can disenchant, in a way, video games by thinking about enslaving work as well. So it's material resources, but also human resources of artisanal cobalt miners. And this is one of the most powerful ethnographic work on cobalt mines in the Republic of Congo. We can also think of the overwhelming production and consumption of data. And this is just, a couple of examples, and some of them already very old, if you think about the digital realm, 2019. That's something that becomes a lot more material, right? Million dates a week, 2.7 billions of hours of Twitch content. These things are not flying up the air, right? Multiplayer games neither. They're sitting on infrastructure that looks like this. And still on the left side of the picture, it's quite a nice tech and sleek, colorful vision. But it's actually, data or electrical signals that are flowing through very material infrastructures of cables mostly. And computers that we need, in order to play or process that data are also machines that are made out of highly processed, of course, but natural resources. So these are just a few more examples. And this material dimension of technologies and the internet is something that's very revealing in a report by Greenpeace from 2017, Clicking Clean, where they call data centers as the factories of the digital age. And it's a very powerful metaphor. In the industrial era, something else was produced in the factories. And in many ways, the same infrastructures that were back then used for producing other things are now turned also into digital centers. But this is what we're in the developed part of the world, at least, or many other, it doesn't have to be the Western part of the world. China is also leading in this. These are the factories of the digital age, and they're very real, very material, and very tangible. I have here as well from that report, it's another very strong image if you think about data, and games are also data, especially multiplayer games played via network. That's why I'm bringing those examples here to play. Up to 2003, as a global community, we had accumulated 5 exabytes of digital content. It's quite abstract, but it's the relation I think that's interesting here. 5 exabytes up to 2003 for the first, let's say, 13 years of the internet. Today, and that today was said in 2019, we consume 10,000 exabytes, not 5, every couple of days, right? With the ideas of the metaverse, you probably all have heard from Meta, from Facebook coming a year and a half ago, this huge vision video with Mark Zuckerberg, the idea of making internet a 3D VR world means basically generating much more data, and that data has to sit somewhere and run through a very material infrastructure. So it's all really related. In a way, you can think about it in the sense that it's all earthly and resting literally on earthly matter. It requires resources, energy, human labor. One of the most interesting examples of this kind of materiality of gaming hardware is a piece of journalist work. You can read this. It's open access in The Verge. The journalist invited 2 material scholars from the University of Cambridge to literally dismantle PlayStation 4 bit by bit, open it, look under the hood, and try to think and deconstruct, let's say, the materials that are part of it, from the plastic case, something that requires oil, basically, it's oil industry, one of the products of the oil industry, through the different electronic components inside and the kind of metals that they require. This is just a quotation from that article. It's really interesting and powerful. And here gold and tin are mentioned as classified so-called conflict minerals, a term that refers to resources originating from Congo and its neighboring countries. This region has faced ongoing violence for the past 30 years, funded in part by complex factors, mineral wealth, which is estimated at $24,000 trillion. I think also, thinking more broadly again, geopolitically, what's happening today with something that you have been confronted with in the news of US global geopolitics and the Ukrainian war. This focus on the minerals is not a coincidence, of course. These are the minerals that you need in order to, again, power, the 21st century digital, I don't want to call it revolution, but we need more and more of those resources. And they become a point of a very strategic a point, maybe even sometimes pushing, different countries and different powers to different types of actions. This is another piece of information, this time again from the report done by the Greenpeace, And this one is telling us that if we think about gaming hardware or any electronic hardware, according to Greenpeace, 70 to 80% of the energy footprint of personal electronic devices occurs during the manufacturing phase. And I'm just bringing this to our attention because usually when you read guides and guidelines that are done by the game industry for the game industry, you will read exactly the opposite. That's interesting. I'm not judging right now. I'm just kind of putting this up there. So in those materials, you will read that it is the personal use of the device that creates the biggest emission footprint. And I bring this thing to our attention to kind of, it goes back into this individualistic framework that I mentioned in discussion earlier on, of putting back or shifting the focus on the individual consumer instead of on, the manufacturing of the devices. So there's a lot of conflicting data out there. Greenpeace is an independent body. The data produced by many of those games guides is not produced by any independent body. It's actually produced by the biggest companies, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. We will not have time now to go into details, just as a point to illustrate. So this is from a Green Games Guide. And as you can see, raw materials in this iconography, components and game system manufacturing, and data centers and networks, something I mentioned, are also mentioned there, but they're not unpacked. They're not touched. These are, of course, very uncomfortable realities. Those realities that are not only material, they are also, geopolitical, where things are produced, in what conditions, how the raw materials are mined, who's mining them, in what conditions, who's buying them, who's consuming, and so on and so forth. So that brings me to the end, actually, and I wanted to end with two things. On the one hand, with a very powerful quotation, again, coming from a developer. We need to do politics as game developers. And this is actually something coming not from an avant-garde game designer, it's coming from a AAA company developer. And we need to find a balance of how to do it. I think it's interesting, this kind of awareness that games are also, they're not only, media of politics, they're part of a larger geopolitical problems. And as I told you, I will end with one game coming from avant-garde scene that problematizes the materiality of the medium itself. And it was taken down from the App Store immediately after it was released. It's a game called Phone Story by La Molindustria. There's one person behind it, Paolo Pedercini, who's a developer, and he says about himself that he's designing radical games. All of his games actually are highly political, touch very uncomfortable issues. And this one was designed more than 10 years ago now for mobile phones, and it was about the production of mobile phones. And this image here depicts the child labor by digging out and extracting raw materials that are then needed for producing electronics. So this has been this very uncomfortable and shocking fact was actually touched upon in a video game, very quickly taken down. Not many people know about this because you have to be kind of, interested in the avant-garde scene to stumble upon it. You can play an emulation of it. But I guess this is, maybe a bit of a disheartening example for the end. At the same time, I think uplifting, because it also shows that you have, if App Store is taking it down, you have kind of the power in that medium to tackle very uncomfortable topics that are usually, tackled by maybe documentary films, reportages, investigative journalism, and so on and so forth. So thank you for your attention. And I think we have just maybe a few minutes left, not many. And if you still want to ask a question, make a comment, or contribute in any way to part 3 or any of the other parts of the talk, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much.